Welcome to the Sport Passion Podcast. And here is your host, Lars Marendorf.
Hello and welcome to the Sport Passion Podcast, and welcome to the anniversary issue of the Sport Passion Podcast, episode 500. My first episode aired in August 2020 about the Western Conference qualification round back then when we had COVID. It's been almost 4.5 years and it's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope for you guys as well. Thanks a lot to all the listeners. Thanks to everyone who listens to the podcast, who shares the podcast, who helps the podcast audience grow. I know it's mainly a German NHL podcast show, but this one is an English episode. I wanted to have some special guests here for this anniversary episode, and I think we've got a great lineup. Larry Brooks from the New York Post, a columnist, will come on. He's Hall of Fame decorated columnist. He's been on my show before. Then we'll have Michael Russo from The Athletic, who covers the Minnesota Wild, but also the league in general. And the third guest is Frank Seravalli from the Daily Faceoff Network, who's also one of the insiders in regards to trade, in regards to breaking stories there in the NHL. So I think it's a great lineup. I hope you guys think about that the same way. If not, please give me feedback. You guys know, if you look into the show notes, where to find me and how to address me. I also put all the links to the different profiles of my guests into the show notes. I put links to their either newspapers, homepages, or platforms into the show notes there as well. So if you want to follow them, please do that. Please help out there as well. And yeah, that's about it for me. It's been a fun ride. I hope it continues. I hope we're going straight on to 1,000 episodes there, and it's been fun for 500 ones, and I hope you guys enjoy this special anniversary episode number 500 of the Sport Passion Podcast. So, as mentioned, Larry Brooks is first from the New York Post, and we're going to talk about how his work might have changed from when he started back in the 70s, about the New York Rangers, obviously, about Matt Rempe. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, and as I mentioned in the interview, I might mention it there, that Larry is just such a great source of knowledge and tales, and he could have gone on for, I would guess, hours talking about all the different things he knows from the Rangers and around the league. So enjoy the first guest, Larry Brooks from the New York Post. From New York, live on tape, I would say it's Larry Brooks from the New York Post. Larry, thanks a lot for taking the time for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure.
Larry, we did talk a couple years ago in New Jersey, and you are a true veteran. You've seen everything in New Jersey. You've been in the communication of the team as well. You've worked for an NHL team. You started in the mid-70s covering the league. What has changed in your daily work regarding the teams? Is it still that you are there at the morning skates? Is it still that you're there in the practice facilities? Or is it more like using techniques like text messages, like connecting to people via that way? What is your work look right now?
I'm no longer actually the Rangers beat writer, so I'm no longer a beat writer. I'm a columnist.
Mm-hmm.
But so that means we have a young woman named Molly Walker who has been the Rangers beat writer. So she travels with the team. She does the game stories. I don't travel very much during the regular season. I travel during the playoffs. But when I'm writing, the day really is very similar, because if there's a home game, I try and go to the morning skate, although teams don't have morning skates as often as they used to when I started. But I'll go to the morning skate, I'll go to practice, and I will just write a column instead of the game story or the off day story. But so my day is somewhat similar, although of course, there was no social media back when I started. So occasionally I'll tweet, but I don't really focus on that. Like the younger people do more of the social media. So I am, I'm actually working pretty much the same routine as I did. There are texts instead of phone calls most of the time, or, the text ahead of a phone call, do you have a minute? Whereas, in the old days, you would just cold call somebody. You would just call someone. There was no caller ID. But my, the nuts and bolts of my job have remained the same. It's probably a little bit different for the younger people who are so immersed in social media and do their Instagram and, do their TikTok and do the Twitter. I just kind of dip my toes into that.
And you mentioned social media. You created a little bit of a buzz just recently because you had a report, or you had heard from someone that Brady Tkachuk could be a player that the New York Rangers were targeting. I don't want to really dive into that story because I think that it was valid reporting, but what I liked about it was, first of all, you were openly talking about it afterwards on the podcast, and what I really liked was the way that the Ottawa Senators and especially their owner reacted, because they felt like they were pressured into the corner. He talked about soft tampering. What was your take on that, the reaction from the Senators? Because I think that the way Andlauer has reacted to that and to other stories as well, I think it's good for the league. I think it's good when there are outspoken owners and they are reacting to certain topics around their teams. What is your take as someone who's seen something from, like I said, from the mid-'70s on? What is your take on the way that the Senators just reacted to what you reported?
There was such a blowback. I thought it was actually comical. I mean, there was such an immediate blowback, and because what I reported was accurate. The Rangers, like, he would be number one on their list. Honestly, he would be number one on their list. I didn't say he was about to be traded, but so the immediate blowback, to me, it stunned me. I was shocked when I heard the phrase soft tampering. I kind of laughed, and I think most people, certainly most people in the media, and I think a lot of teams around the league thought it was sort of laughable. There's no such thing as soft tampering. But I then talked to a couple of people, and I think it kind of reflected. I'm fine with it. I was fine with it. And I agree with you. It's good for the league to have engaged owners, to have outspoken people in the league where so many people, resort to cliches. You don't want cliches. So
Exactly.
That's great. But I think it also reflected, an insecurity coming from a small market team that saw a reporter from the biggest market team in the league saying, "Hey, the Rangers want this guy that you have. The Rangers want your captain." And I think that just, I think it framed it as a small market Canadian team against the big, bad New York market team. So I think that was part of the dynamic, but again, like honestly, I was shocked. I was just shocked.
I mean, you've got everybody. The Athletic, they just had recently, they have trade scenarios, teams they want to have players go to. So it's everyday business. Everybody's doing that. And just as you said, you did report that they are about to trade him for this or that player, but just that this might be the exact type of player that they need and that they are targeting for. Just one thing, when you watch a game, when you're in there, and around a game, is there something, I don't know, maybe a stat, maybe something that you're specifically watching, you're looking for in regards to, I don't know, performance by a player, performance by the team? Is there something when you look, I don't know, at the box score or at the advanced metrics, whatever that is that something that you always try to look at and say, okay, that's a good indicator for the way the game has gone?
That's a good one, because I'm always I always struggle with the expected goals versus what has actually happened on the ice. I understand that listen, teams have sophisticated analytics departments. They break down games that are differently than the public websites where you get all the you get all the figures. And so, scoring chances, they come off a sheet. They probably aren't technically accurate, but I think they reflect a trend in the game. But when I'm looking at a game and I see a player was on, let's say, for 3 goals scored and none against, but his expected goal ratio was in the 30s, people might say that's a bad game. But to me, it's what happens, not what should have happened, And so I always wrestle with the expected goals. Now, I get that, expected goals and stats like that would be extremely important in evaluating a player going forward. Like, you look back and you say, well, his expected goal rate is in the 30s. We're not going to sign him. We're not going to draft him. We're not going to trade for him. Okay, that's fine. But when I'm looking at a season and I'm reporting on what the season is, if a player has been on, say, for 50 goals and 30 against, I don't care what his expected goal rate is. I don't care what his expected goal rate is. He's had a great season to me, So that's an area that I wrestle with. When I watch the game, generally it's who has the puck, who gets it out, who keeps it in. I think, to me, the most important stat, really, if you can break down this game into stats, which I think is very, very difficult still. If you break it down, though, I want to know offensive zone time, offensive zone possession time. That's what I want to know. Because when you have the puck, you're going to win the game. And so teams that can't get out of their own end, when you see a team scrambling to get out, they can't clear the puck cleanly. There's no coherent breakout. That's what I look at. But it just jumps out. It jumps out at you when you're watching a game. You know who has the puck. You know who is in control of the game.
Yeah, just like you said, some stats are great in certain cases, but oftentimes it's also the eye test and what you see and what you also feel. I mean, for you, for watching the league for so many years, you have a feeling for a game and you have a feeling for what goes on the ice, and regardless of expected goals or Corsi or whatever you have there as a metric, sometimes it's just also body language of the players, stuff like that. There's no stat for body language, and that's something that's still very, very valuable. Momentum swings is something that there's no real stat for that. That's just like you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's great that there are all these stats available, but I do rely on the eye test.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I try to have certain stats ready, but sometimes it's hard because we don't get to watch as many games as you guys. So sometimes it's just you just look at the box score, then you try to get some more metrics in there, some more stats. You get a feeling for it, but sometimes when I go and rewatch the game, I say, okay, yeah, the stats were nice, but those stats didn't reflect what was really going on the ice. So it's sometimes you have to be careful with stats there.
I agree, and one thing I think it's interesting. I like looking at offensive zone starts. When you break it down by players and lines, because that gives you an indication of what the coach thinks, how the coach is deploying his players. So. I think that's an interesting one for me. Offensive zone, defensive zone. Like, if you're using one, which center do you want in the defensive zone circle? Which center do you want taking the defensive zone draws? And that's an interesting one for me because, and you look at the time, the matchups, you can see the matchups when you're looking at that. So, I think for me, I'm interested in the stats that kind of reflect how the coach is approaching the game. Also, that I think that's valuable, a very valuable tool.
Yeah, you mean the zone, and also sometimes it's also when the face-off is taking place. Is it with 10 minutes to go? Is it with 1 minute to go? So that's also something where you can see the coach's trust on a certain player, on a certain line.
Exactly.
It's also something where you can interpret that.
Exactly.
Since you've covered the league, have you seen a title contender fall apart in that way that the Rangers just did in the last couple of weeks? Have you ever seen, I mean, there's been playoff series where some teams were, just for 2 years ago, the Bruins were a title contender, or was it 2 years ago, they set all the records, they were the favorite to win it all, and then they get demolished, or not demolished, but they lose in 7 games against Florida, which is, which was a kind of a collapse there. But that was in a playoff series, and it's a matchup thing also, oftentimes. But with the Rangers, they were a title contender, coming off 2 Eastern Conference Finals in 3 years, and they were starting good. The season start was okay for them, and then Drury felt something. He sent out his memo to all the other GMs regarding players who might be available. And I think from that point on, it all fell apart. Have you seen something like that before in your career?
So a couple of things. No, I've never seen a team. I've never seen a substantial team fall apart like this in the first half of this season. But I also have to say that I didn't think that I thought this was going to be a difficult year for them. I thought they're going to have a tough time. I actually did not pick them to go to the conference final. I thought they would lose in the first or second round this year. And I thought the reason I thought that was because I think the whole thing had gotten stale. They had gone at it. They came up short against Tampa Bay in 22. And then they came up short against Florida in 24, basically for the same reasons. They were just not big enough, not physical enough, not big enough. When you get to the Final Four, you have to be able to get to the net, and you have to be able to stop the other team from getting to the net. The battles. It's all the battles. And they were not strong enough, not physical enough, not big enough, didn't have that kind of a mentality. They just didn't have that personnel to play that way. So they're, a very talented team. And then when they got to the Final Four, they just came up a little bit short, and they kind of knew that after losing in the spring, after losing to the Panthers. It was a 6-game series, but they were brutalized by Florida. Brutalized by
they were outplayed a lot of games. Yeah.
Well, because they were physically mauled.
Yeah.
They were just mauled physically. And, Shesterkin kept them in. So, and, they're up 2-1 in the series, and game 4 is in overtime. So it was actually, they had a possibility, but they were outplayed decisively. Anyway, they kind of knew that they needed to change the team. So they tried to trade Jacob Trouba to clear cap space. Trouba blocked the trade, even though his no move clause had become a 15-team no trade, and they tried to trade him to one of the teams on the list. It didn't work, and so that started. I think that started a negative dynamic. That Trouba knew that they wanted to trade him, that they had tried to trade him, that they were going to try and trade him. It's impossible to have a lame duck captain who is unhappy. And I think that filtered into the team at the start of the year. Even though they had a really good record, they were 12-4-1. They were playing poorly. Their record was an optical illusion. They were carried by Shesterkin and Jonathan Quick, and everyone was talking about how badly they were playing, and that this was not sustainable. And they had 2 back-to-back games in Calgary and Edmonton where they simply did not show up for the first period. After those 2 games, that's when Drury sent the memo. Now, I think it was a mistake. I wouldn't have done it that way. But at the same time, I've seen a lot worse. And I have never seen a team respond to that in this way, where they just kind of gave up. They stopped competing for a while. And so, no, I have never really. There have been so many issues at this point that I don't ever recall a good team falling apart like this so early in the season.
And you made some good points there, and they were also on my preview list. That what has happened in the last couple of years, we talked about advanced metrics, and you can think about what you want, but the Rangers in certain metrics never had good numbers because Shesterkin was covering them, and also their offense was helping them out. They were able, in certain cases, and especially during the regular season, they were able to outscore sometimes and had Shesterkin or Quick making life easier.
Right. Because of their power play, too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's why. I mean, their 5-on-5 metrics have not been good for years, but their power play has always been, or at least the last 5 or 6 years, their power play has been one of the best in the league. And actually, and that was an issue even against Florida when they were, I think, 1 for 20 against the Panthers, and so when their power play stops, they stop. And their power play this year has been awful. After the first 4 games of the season, it has been awful. And it kind of makes sense because all of their best players on the first power play, and none of their best players are having good seasons. So that, except up until 3 weeks ago, Panarin was having a very good year.
Yep.
But over the last 3 or 4 weeks, he is shut down too. So their power play, I think at this point, is 1 for 30 in their last 10 or 11 games. They're toward the bottom of the league in power play, which is remarkable, given the talent. But none of these guys are having good seasons, and and you're right. They have been able to succeed despite flaws, but all of their flaws have caught up with them.
And they also, I mean, they had a couple of career seasons with Kreider 2 years ago, with Panarin also playing very good, but also something that, I mean, you mentioned he started the season good. He was always a good regular season guy. What I wondered about was in the playoffs, I think teams were able to focus a little bit more on him probably, but also maybe it was more physical than he expected or he is used to in the regular season. So that's something as well. How much is the coach to blame for it? Because in a way, it's a little similar to what happened 2 years with the last coach, where they went to the Eastern Conference Final, and the year after there was a kind of like a setback. How much is Peter Laviolette to blame for it, do you think?
I think the coaching staff shares the blame. I think it's part of the problem. But I think this has been a very difficult team to coach. And I've written about this for years. When they started their rebuild in 2018, when, after a decade of contending for the Cup, they realized they weren't going to quite get there. Their players were older. So they, remember ownership and management sent out a letter to the season ticket holders saying, "Look, we're going to rebuild." So they hired David Quinn as their coach. They Alain Vigneault, 5 years, his contract was not renewed. So, and they were going to rebuild with younger players. So they hired a coach out of college, out of Boston University, named David Quinn. And the first year was kind of a rebuilding year. The second year, though, they acquired Adam Fox. They signed Panarin as a free agent, and they traded for Jacob Trouba. So that changed the dynamic of the team. It was also that year in the middle of the season, they brought up Shesterkin. And the Rangers charged the second half of the year. The season was stopped because of COVID, but they were actually invited into that 2014 tournament, that playoff in the bubble. No one expected them to be good that season, but they were good, and they played extremely well for Quinn. Panarin had a great season. Zibanejad had the best year of his life. They were, they were responding to David Quinn. Within a year, they had turned on David Quinn. He was too hard. He was too oppressive. He micromanaged off the ice. He was always in their business. And so David Quinn was fired. And they hired somebody who was totally opposite, Gerard Gallant, right? Where he basically comes in and says, "Go play." And all his reputation was he was not an X's and O's guy, but he's a great players coach. So, so Gallant comes in, totally different from Quinn, says, "Just go play. I trust you. You're pros. You know how to do it." They go to the conference finals. The next season, it's not a good year, even though they wound up having a very good second half and finished with over 100 points, but they got knocked out in the first round by the Devils. And so the players, in their exit interviews after they lose, go in and say, "We need someone who's going to be harder. We need harder practices. We need a coach who's going to have more systems. There's no structure. There was no structure with Gallant. We didn't make adjustments." So they fired Gallant, and after a while, they hired Laviolette, who was known as a guy who would run hard practices and, had and their response to him honestly, they were an exceptionally well-coached team last year. They responded to him. Their practices were incredible. Really, some of the best practices I've seen. They go to the conference final. The next year they come back and it's kind of like, I don't know. It's bizarre. It's bizarre, especially for a group that has never won anything. Now I was around, and covered and was around the Devils.
Yeah.
In their heyday.
The prime 95, 2000,
They
2003,
were, Right. But they were always at the top. Always. They were winning divisions. They were always there. They from 1990
finals,
really from
and stuff like that. Yeah.
394 to like 2009, they were probably the best team in the East. But they were a very difficult group to coach. They were. They had very, very strong personalities on that team, and they went through a lot of coaches. The difference is they won 3 Stanley Cups. This team has won nothing. And it's a strange group. It's kind of entitled at times. They're treated like royalty by the organization. Everyone wants to play here. I know there have been people who have said, well, because of the memo, because of Jacob Trouba, because they put Barclay Goodrow on waivers.
Barclay Goodrow, yeah, exactly.
People aren't going to come. Everyone wants to come. Everyone wants to play for the New York Rangers. Honestly, they just treat their players so well. But it's a strange group. It's a strange group. It has and I wrote, and I said many times early in the season, even when they were winning, that it's stale.
Mm-hmm.
Bound together too long without winning anything, and it's now bottoming out.
It's just so enlightening when it comes from someone who's not around the team every day, but who's covered so many teams there and who's pretty close to the team. You mentioned you've seen the practices a lot, so it is something that is pretty much giving more light to what has happened there, because from the outside it just looked strange that I knew that I thought last year they were not the best team in the Eastern Conference, but I thought that they were a good team. And if you have the right matchups, if you have maybe no injuries, the other team has an injury here or there, you can make a deep run. They did that. But I didn't also expect them to be at the bottom of the standings just like they did this year.
No.
There's one player I want to talk about just for a couple of reasons, because he created a lot of news last year, and I called the outdoor games against the Islanders and the other one that the Devils played against the Flyers, and Matt Rampy was the guy who came in. He got his debut there just seconds in. He fights Matt Martin. There's a lot of buzz there. Then in the next couple of games, he fights all the other heavyweights, and then in the playoffs he returns. But he also has got suspended. He's played 22 games. He's got suspended for 12 games. You talked about how they missed some physicality and how you've seen maybe the game also changed from the years you've covered in the 80s and 90s. But is Matt Rampy, from your point of view, is Matt Rampy a player that has a place in the Rangers roster and has a place in the league?
I don't understand, and I wrote this back in September at training camp. I don't understand what happened. Matt Rampy is a raw player. He has a lot of learning to do. He has a lot of improving to do. But when he came up last year, the Rangers had gone through a couple of months where they were kind of playing 500. You know, they were up, they were down, they were in the middle, but they had a great start. So, you know, their playoff, you know, you knew they were going to be in the playoffs, but they weren't playing well. Like, it was really like a 6-week or 2-month thing where they would win one, lose one, you know, win two, lose two. And there really was a lack of physicality, and maybe even at times a lack of energy. They brought up Rempe, and he changed the team. He changed the team. He changed the entire dynamic of the team. They became a more physical team. Teams were looking around for Rempe because, you know, he was a loose cannon, kind of. He was hard on the forecheck. And they had a record of something like, and, you know, you can check it, but they had a record of something like 14-2-1 when he was in the lineup in the regular season. I think it was 14-2-1. Start the playoffs. They win their first 7 games.
Yep.
They sweep Washington. They win their first 3 against Carolina. Shesterkin was great. And Rempe had played the first 6 games of the playoffs. When it got to game 3 against Carolina on the road, Laviolette was reluctant to play him on the road because of matchups. It was also a thing where everything Rempe did, because of his size, became so magnified that referees were calling games differently. We're calling Rempe differently. They were officiating Rempe differently. I had, you know, there were referees who were lecturing him, waving fingers in his face. I honestly. And so the rest of the playoffs, kind of, Rempe was in and out. He played a couple of games. He scratched for most of them. But he worked hard over the summer.
I saw that.
Came east to train with Chris Kreider, like for the last month of the summer. He was in great shape. He had improved his skating. Came on a training camp, and for whatever reason, and I haven't been able to learn anything about this. Whatever reason, Laviolette just didn't trust him, just wouldn't play him. And I think it is one of the biggest mistakes they made. Now, listen, I have a lot of people telling me Rempe can't play. Rempe can't play. You're wrong about this. Rempe can't play. And, you know, that's a possibility. But I would like to have seen him given the chance. I don't understand why he didn't start the season playing. And look, if he was picking up penalties, if he was, being suspended, okay, I get it. But the coaching staff, maybe management, did not recognize the impact that Matt Rempe had on last year's team. And to me, it is one of the biggest failures of this organization this year. And I know he came back up, ran across the ice, has gotten himself suspended for 8 games. But I think a lot of that is because he is now, anytime he gets a chance, he's overeager.
Yeah. Yep.
He's just overeager. He wants,
Yep.
Again, to me, the Rempe situation just confuses me. And I think it's part of this story.
Yeah, very good explanation. And it looked to me like that as well. Just that he was happy to come up and then over-motivated. Just, I have to do something. I have to do something immediately. I want to stay in the team. And then he just went overboard, did that check, and now he's suspended. And they just today they sent him down because they picked up Kaliyev from the Los Angeles Kings. Just as you mentioned, I was wondering, I mean, it's not the same player, but he kind of reminded me a little bit from his stature and maybe from what he could be able to do of Valeri Nichushkin from the Avs, who's also big, who could stand in front of the net. You can't move him, and that was something that I just thought that why not try Rempe in that position? Why not help? You mentioned Kreider. Who's better to learn how to play in front of the net than Chris Kreider? He's just the ideal teacher for that. So if you got a guy who's bigger than Kreider but might be able to do the same stuff, that was just something. And it's pretty cool to hear from you that. And I saw the tapes. I saw him skating in the summer. I saw those tapes where he tried to improve his skating. So there was something he realized. I have to do more. I have to do other things than what I did last year. And it's interesting to hear that pretty much the team blocked him or just said, well, you're not good enough. We want you in the minor leagues. Very interesting.
It was never really explained. And believe me, I've asked. I've asked over and over.
I'm sure.
You don't get many explanations. You don't get many explanations. Yeah. That's something that's changed in the game too. I mean, now we're talking about an evolution of 50 years, but
yeah.
And I know when I started, it was a much smaller league. It was kind of a mom and pop operation almost. But players and coaches and general managers, they talked. And again, there was no social media, so if someone said something, maybe it would get around the league, maybe. Now, of course, anyone says anything, it's on, social media within 60 seconds, and there's a huge blowback to it. But players and people in the league were so much more outspoken. And as you even referenced, the Ottawa owner here, a departure from the norm right now. But no, I have asked repeatedly, and I've not gotten an explanation.
Oh, Larry, I'm sure you could go on. It's just fun to listen to you. I'm sure you've got a lot of stories. I think I asked you a little last time. Have you ever thought about writing a book, putting some of the stories you've experienced into a book?
The reason I haven't written a book is I don't think there's enough money in hockey books. I know how much work you have to do to write a good book. I know that. I know because I have friends who write books, and I know that it is just a great deal of work. There's just you never stop writing, and I feel that I've been writing for 50 years. I write almost every day, and I just don't think. Well, like my son keeps saying, you should write a book. Like, how are you not going to write a book? And I say, well, I don't know. So at this point, I don't think so. But I guess I would never say never.
Okay. You mentioned your son, and one thing I remember reading that when you were recognized by the Hall of Fame, you said that it would be cool to take the grandson and granddaughter. I don't know if you have a grandson or a granddaughter, but have you taken them to the Hall of Fame? Okay, and have you taken them there?
They were at my induction ceremony.
Oh, nice. That's nice.
Yeah, it was in 2018, and
yeah, I know.
My grandson, my Scott was about 7, and Reese, who's my granddaughter, was almost 6, and so they could appreciate it. Now, Scott's a really nice hockey player. He plays 14U here, and that's when I'm not working. I spend all my time at the rink watching him. All my time. I mean, I'm at the rink all the time, either with the Rangers or with the Ridgefield Lions, and cool. it is it's the most fun I've had.
I can imagine.
Yeah, he's a very skilled player, very creative. He's one of these these kids, every generation, you can see, I mean, how skilled all of these players are now coming up because they just, they skate, the way they handle the puck, the way they see the ice. And Scott is one of these kids. Now, I'm not saying he's Gabe Perreault. I'm not saying he's going to play on the world, on Team USA, or he's going to be a pro. He's not, I don't think. But he just loves the game, and I just love watching him. And, so he, it is great that that he and Reese both appreciate my career, and I appreciate them. It's fantastic.
Larry, that's just great. I can imagine how it would be as a father. I've got two kids, two young daughters as well who are playing sports. So it's always great just to see them react with the team, how they play, how they develop their personality. So it's amazing, and it's just great that they got to know what you are doing and appreciate that, but you got also to see them grow up. So that's just fun.
Right. No, I know. And I agree with you that there have been horror stories about hockey culture, and I recognize it. But there's also a lot good in hockey culture, and there's when I watch Scott, look, I enjoy that he's a good player, but it's more important that he's a good teammate. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's more important that that he has, that he's supportive and has friends on the team. So that's what I enjoy. And I do believe that, with the right people in charge, that it is a great environment. Youth hockey is a great environment if the right people are in charge.
Yeah. That's just pretty much a good word to sum up our podcast. Larry, it's a pleasure. Again, I could go on and you could go on. I couldn't go. I could ask questions, but you would go on for hours. It's so much fun to listen to you. I was in the U.S. in October. I was not in New York. I hope to come there again, and it would be great to meet you again to talk a little bit to you. And it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to read your column. People can do that. It's great to see you on. I think you were on, was it Spit and Chicklets, the podcast show there as well.
Yeah.
You are on a couple of those as well. It's always great to hear from you, to read from you. Larry, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for all the information, the stories, and just enjoy covering the team, but enjoy more seeing your grandson playing hockey. That's a cool thing and something great to be able to do.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks. Listen, when you come, if you're in New York, make sure you look me up. Okay.
Good. So on the phone from St. Paul, Minnesota, I'm honored to have Michael Russo on. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
Michael, I know you've lived in Florida as well, so it's the winter time. What is the better place to be in the winter? Is it Minnesota or Florida?
I would say definitely Florida. The weather doesn't bother me too much, but I just got back from North Carolina yesterday and came back, and it was about 2 degrees Fahrenheit here.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very cold, and so hopefully it'll start warming up. We go out to California and Vegas this week, so it should get warm pretty soon.
Oh, okay, yeah, I guess that's the case there with Vegas, and you got the West Coast swing with San Jose also in there.
Yeah, the Wild play there on it's back-to-back games. I think it's Saturday, Sunday. So they've been playing well, much better on the road lately than at home.
Okay. You're a true veteran. It's your 30th season, I think, covering the league. What has changed the most for you in your daily work since you started to cover the NHL? Right now, we've got. Go ahead.
Yeah, probably social media. I mean, back in the old days, if if there was a trade made, you didn't have to immediately tweet out all the information or get it online or things like that. Yet, if you're having lunch and a trade was made, you actually finished your lunch, that type of thing. It's not that way anymore. Obviously, just the whole PR perspective of covering a team is very, very different. Things are basically broken online, and next thing you know, everything's out in the next couple seconds and things like that. In terms of on the ice, actual hockey, I mean, the product is so much better than it used to be. Faster, more skilled. You don't need fighters really anymore. Undersized, smaller guys could succeed in today's league just because there's no hooking and holding and things like that. Everybody has to skate to be able to play this sport now. So things have changed absolutely dramatically since I started covering the league in the mid '90s.
We'll talk about the on-ice product and especially the Wild soon, but just from your daily work, also including, like, you're not only a Wild insider, but you're also covering a lot of National Hockey League topics. First of all, I'm always wondering how you guys get assigned, because I think you were assigned to the playoffs as well last year, because the Wild missed the playoffs, so you got assigned to covering the playoffs. How does that work? Is it because you are generally not a specific Wild editor, or is it because you were just free because of the Wild missed the playoffs?
Well, that definitely was part of it. My day job is definitely covering the Wild, but I have a colleague here in Minnesota named Joe Smith, and we sort of split the team.
I know him.
But I'm also one of I'm one of our national writers as well. For instance, when the Four Nations starts next month, and all my colleagues get to go to the Bahamas and Mexico and Europe and things like that, I am covering the Four Nations with Pierre LeBrun and Chris Johnston, two of our other national writers. I'll be in both Montreal and Boston for that tournament. I'll cover the Olympics next year. I'll cover the GM's meetings. But yeah, when the Minnesota Wild were eliminated last year, or didn't make the playoffs, I basically covered. They essentially said to me, which team do you want to cover? And I picked a team that I thought would have a chance to go on a really far run. And obviously we don't cover the Florida Panthers. So I sort of picked them, and it lucked out. I wound up covering them for 2 months. And obviously they went on and won the Stanley Cup, against a really good Edmonton team in McDavid and Draisaitl. And honestly, I think if Draisaitl is probably healthy in that seventh, not only the seventh game, probably that entire series, I mean, Edmonton might be the Cup champions. He was that good, but he was that banged up as well. So, he's showing himself right now to be an unbelievable hockey player. Might be the MVP of the league this year if they keep it up.
Yeah, might win his first Rocket Richard there as well. So you and Joe are pretty much like the good luck charm for teams from Florida, I guess. But just from a daily perspective, you talked about the trades were announced differently back in the days. Now it's I can imagine that you as an insider, you're doing a lot probably via messaging. Is it still also more valuable to have people in person, to be able, you're traveling with the Wild, to be able to talk to other teams, to other media there as well, other players? Is that more valuable, or is more going on a text message platform like that?
Yeah, I mean, now you can, everything can be done by phone these days, and, a GM or a scout is always a text message away. But I still like to be in person. I think, it's important to show your face, and, I'll be in Vegas next week, and I'm doing a Jack Eichel feature, and I'd rather, for that feature to sit down with the player and the GM rather in person rather than doing it via phone. And so but it is, you can do this job definitely remotely, but I just think it's still important to go and sit there and have conversations one-on-one with players, with coaches, with GMs.
Yeah, that's from my experience as well. I mean, I have to do a lot of stuff remotely, but it's always great when, for example, the Global Series was great with a couple of teams coming over. In October, I was also in the US at a couple of NHL locations. So that's always great, just to introduce yourself to certain players, just to say, oh, hey, that's my name, German players, Swiss players, that's me, you talk to on the phone. So it's always great. And also, like you guys, getting to know the media there as well. Let's start talking about the Wild. And I got to admit, when I did my previews for the season, I said, okay, yeah, they might be a bubble team. They might be a team around the playoff spot. If everything goes well, they might sneak into the playoffs. But I didn't expect them to be one of the best teams, not only in a hard Central Division and in the West, but also in the league in general. What has John Hines done since he took over the team that has changed the team in a way that has become one of the best teams in the league?
Yeah, I mean, you're not alone. I mean, I covered the team, and I definitely didn't think they were going to be this good. I mean, a lot of it obviously is better goaltending this year. Phil Gustafsson had a really tough season last year for the Wild. 2 years ago, he had an unbelievable year, had the second best goals against average and save percentage in the NHL, behind Linus Ullmark, and then what happens? He comes back, he gets paid, and then he comes back last year and really struggled. And I think he had trouble, adjusting to being the guy for the first time, being paid for the first time, being a dad for the first time, and I think it affected him. He went back overseas, had a really good World Championship, got himself in tip-top shape, and came back, and he's just been outstanding. So that's definitely number one. Number two, Kaprizov, even though he's hurt right now, has had an unbelievable start to this year. I mentioned Draisaitl, Eichel. These, I think you put the two of them with Kaprizov as being potential Hart Trophy candidates this year. And then the other big thing is they've had just, guys that have been able to fill into roles and just, despite being incredibly injured all year long, guys have come up and played really well, and they've just played a really quality defensive brand of hockey. They've scored a lot more lately. Marco Rossi's having an unbelievable season, especially in light of Kaprizov out. He was just named the number one star of the week today in the NHL. So there's just a lot of different reasons, but John's done a really good job of getting these guys, playing really structured hockey. And John is a very technical coach. Respects his guys really well, puts them in proper positions to succeed, and so far he's done wonders.
Yeah, that's what happens when you talk to an insider. You just pretty much put in some of my notes there in regards to Marco Rossi as well. That's completely fine. And John Hines is great, obviously, as a coach, but also Bill Guerin, he has one of the hardest jobs in the league because he's got about $50 million in dead cap space lying around. What has he done in the last couple of years, and how creative is he with finding players, maybe being able to have a contract structured so that maybe next year a guy gets a raise and not this year? What has he done to be able to give John Hines such a good team? And also what you refer to is players coming up. It's not like you said, I mean, Kaprizov, maybe his MVP case is hurt because he's missing games, but there are players coming in from the minor leagues to help them out. And that's also key to have those players ready there in the minor league. So Bill Guerin has done a great job. Could you just talk a little bit about what he's done the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's the other reason why it's amazing what the Wild are doing right now, because they are spending $15.4 million less than every other team in the NHL because he made a decision 3 years ago to buy out Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. Now, Wild fans are super excited that starting next year, the large pain of that is gone. But he's done a really good job of just putting together a team of that has a real quality mix of young guys. They have 3 23-year-olds on their team that have just been outstanding in Matt Boldy, Brock Faber, and Marco Rossi. And then veterans, from the Zuccarellos and the Fleuries at the top end to, guys that are like Eriksson Ek and in the sort of older 20s, young 30s, the Marcus Folignos and people like that. So there's just a really quality balance of grit on this team, of talent and skill, and then obviously of speed. And so, it's been really interesting to watch because I don't think any of us expected them to be this good. They really tried to add depth to the minor leagues this this off season, because they felt like they were calling up guys last year that weren't put in positions that they could really succeed if they were going to play in third and fourth line roles. And this year they went out and they signed a bunch of guys that have played 200, 300, 400 games in the National Hockey League and put them in the minors. And then when they got super hurt, they were able to put these guys up. They don't score a ton, but they don't give up a ton either. So the Devin Shores and the Brandon Gonses and the Ben Jones, they've really done put Eden some pretty good minutes this year. So it's been really impressive watching the balance of this team.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned Marco Rossi a couple of times already, and just today, as you mentioned, he was named first star of last week from the league. I think he had 11 points or 8 points in 3 games. I think 8 points in 3 games, and he wasn't bad last year at the Global Series, but right now he's almost setting career highs already with half of the season still to play. What has happened to him? Obviously, he's got a bigger role and a new coach, but what have you seen from him that has made him a true number one center right now in one of the best teams in the league?
Yeah, he just gets more and more comfortable, and what most impressive is he's doing this without Kirill Kaprizov in the lineup. So a lot of times when you play with a superstar like Kirill and you're his center, and you're getting points, people just look at you as like, all right, you're just, anybody could play with Kirill. And now Kirill's out of the lineup. And what's Marco done? He's had 9 points with Kirill out of the lineup and 8, as you mentioned last week, to be named the number one star in the league, scoring clutch goals all the time, especially in the third period. The biggest thing with Marco is his professionalism and his maturity. 3 years ago, he looked like he wasn't ready to play in the NHL. He went to the minors for the rest of the year, and then he made the decision 2 summers ago to spend the majority of the summer here in Minnesota. He went to the World Championships, spent a little time back in Austria, and then he came back here for the months of July and August. He actually didn't go to his sister's wedding, and it was all because he wanted to skate with NHL players, work out with the Wild strength coach, and skate with their skating instructor. And it had paid huge dividends last year, where he had the second most goals behind Connor Bedard amongst rookies. Well, this year he's been just so much better. He's going to get 70 points. He's just been absolutely unbelievable. The biggest thing with him is, despite the fact that he might not be the biggest guy, he's got unbelievable courage. He goes to the hard areas. He goes to the front of the net. If you look at his analytics, all the goals and all his shots that he scores are from a couple feet from the net. He's willing to go to the places that you need to go to score in the National Hockey League. And so it's just been incredible to watch his development here at just 23 years old. I think the sky's the limit still for him to be an even better player. The Wild obviously are going to have to re-sign him this offseason. He's going to get a ton of money. I'm for somebody that really respects his game, I'm proud of just the way that he's played, because he's just a terrific kid and an outstanding hockey player who, I'm sure all your listeners too know that, especially, the proximity to Austria, what he was dealing with 3 years ago when he was diagnosed with the heart ailment and had to be shut down for 7 months, couldn't even work out. And then he comes here, 4 years after that scary diagnosis, and almost to the day is the number one star of the NHL.
Yeah, you put in the medical history, I think, in a tweet just today. So that was just that reminded me as well of his issues also during COVID and all the stuff he was dealing with. So great to see him just be successful there. And obviously, you say he can grow even more. And when you see that what he's doing without the best player of the Wild out of the lineup there, that's just amazing, the development he's had in the last couple of years, but also especially this season. Just 2 questions remaining. One is, what is the ceiling for the Wild? Dallas and Colorado were the team I mentioned as contenders in the division. I didn't see Winnipeg being as good as they were because of the way they went out in the playoffs, and I never saw the Wild coming. So what's the ceiling there in regards to the Wild just after almost half of the season for them?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, because they've been incredible against the Eastern Conference this year, but they still haven't proven much against the top teams in the Western Conference. They've only beaten Dallas once. They haven't beaten Winnipeg. In fact, they haven't beaten Winnipeg in 2 years, and they haven't beaten Colorado. They didn't beat them last year, and they play their first game against them on Thursday. So until they start beating the top teams in the Western Conference, I think there's still going to be a lot of people that are going to really be cynical on whether or not this team is as good as everybody thinks they are. They got Vegas on a second of a back-to-back on Sunday as well, and they at least at the beginning of the Vegas franchise, the Wild did really well against them, but not so much the last couple of years. And Vegas is on fire right now, and frankly might be the top, the best playing team right now in the conference. So again, it's hard to say what the ceiling is until we start to see the Wild beat those teams on a consistent basis. This is still a franchise that didn't make the playoffs last year, hasn't advanced past the first round since 2015. And that is the next step for this organization. So they've got to do that. I still think that they have that ability, but they are going to have to be healthy, and they're going to need everybody playing on top of their game to beat the top teams in the West come playoff time.
Yeah, and you mentioned injuries. It's always a matchup that might be good for you or not. So that's something that we'll see once the seedings are there. And maybe, all those teams have to qualify. It's pretty crowded there in the West as well. So let's see who gets in. Last question. What's behind the Russo La Panta European vacation? I saw that, I think, on your Instagram feed. What's the story behind that? You guys, I think you're coming to Madrid and Barcelona this year. What kind of trips have you had? What's behind that?
Yeah, so this is our seventh, I think. LaPanta is the Wild play-by-play guy. He and I are podcast partners as well, real close friends. And because we have this close friendship, a destinations company came to us probably about 9 years ago and said, hey, do you want to do this? And, you guys can be the hosts. People will pay to come with you. And so we've had 30, 40 people every summer that have come with us. So it started, I forget the year because there are a couple pandemic years, but it started – our first trip that we went was where did we go? Edinburgh and Scotland, nice. Glasgow, and then Belfast and Dublin. We've been to Tuscany, including places like Venice and Milan and Como and places like that. We've been to Munich and I'm trying to think where else. Innsbruck, Salzburg, all throughout Switzerland. Lucerne and Zurich. We've done Budapest and Prague and Vienna, and we've done Sicily. We did Portugal last year, and so this year is Spain. So it's a fun trip. We usually get you don't want too much more than 30 because you really only want one bus. But we've had some unbelievable trips, and what's really cool is we have a lot of regulars that come. So a lot of these people have become really good friends of ours, and so. We're trying to sell the Spain trip, and you don't have to be from North America to come. So if any of your listeners want to come, you can reach out to definedestinations.com to get information for it. Although going to Spain is pretty easy for you all.
Yeah, but still, you guys are coming, and I've heard your podcast as well. I've seen you're doing a lot of live shows with the podcast there. I think there's a bar. I don't know if it's today, but I saw a tweet from you where it's scheduled as well. So you guys are doing a lot of those things. So sounds like a lot of fun. The podcast is the worst seat in the house. Is that correct?
Yep, worst seats in the house. It's a joke about how. We always sit in the press box, which is usually the worst seats in the arena.
Yeah,
regarding
Utah's arena right now, there are a lot of worse seats, but they will figure that out. They will figure that out as well. But okay, Michael, thanks a lot for your time. Pleasure talking to you. It's just great reading all your work. You had so many amazing quotes and stories about Marc-Andre Fleury as well just recently. I was able to talk to him a little bit, just a nice guy, and I'm jealous about the way that you can deal with him on an everyday basis, and especially now in his last season. So there's a lot of stuff to read. I always recommend people to subscribe to The Athletic. I think it's well worth spending your money there. So thanks a lot, Michael.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing you again soon.
So, I'm honored and very happy to have someone on who's a true insider in regards to the NHL, Frank Seravalli from Philadelphia, as I just learned. So, Frank, welcome to the show.
Lars, good to be with you. Yeah, met you last year at the Global Series in Stockholm, and great to put a face to the name. I see a lot of the coverage in Europe, and so awesome to be with you.
Yeah, and it was great. That's always something I mentioned to my listeners. One thing is having the teams over here for the Global Series, but for me, it's also nice to see some of you guys in person and to connect a little bit there because sometimes it's not easy to get access to even the media just covering the teams. So it's great to have you there, and thanks a lot for coming on the show. Um, Frank, you're a first-time guest, so for a first-time guest, it's always something that I like to ask them to do is introduce not themselves, but maybe their way into covering hockey, how they got involved with hockey. Maybe you played when you were younger, whatever it is. Just give us a brief overview how you got into the NHL.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it as short as possible. So, I grew up in a hockey family. My dad grew up playing. Really, in our area, the Philadelphia area, it just changed so rapidly after the Flyers won those two Stanley Cups in the mid 1970s, and so everyone was kind of hooked, and that trickled down to me. My uncles played, my cousins played, and so the first thing I wanted to do when I was a kid was start playing hockey, and started at the age of 4. I realized probably when I was just heading off to high school and as a teenager that I wasn't going to be good enough to play at a seriously high level. And so I was trying to figure out what are ways that I could stay in the game. And so for me, was just trying to tap into a different avenue, an opportunity. And at the rinks that I grew up playing at in this area, there was a local hockey magazine. It was called Breakaway Magazine. And it was just one of those free publications that as you come in the door of the rink, and really in rinks from Virginia to Maine on the East Coast, so a pretty big area, that this magazine was published in, and it covered local junior leagues and high school leagues. And I just reached out to the publisher and I just said, hey, I'm interested. I'm a huge hockey fan. I can write a little bit. I'd love to learn more about, hockey writing. And he says, okay, can you get to this place over here? And we'll meet. And I said, yeah, is it okay if my mom drives me? I was still a teenager, and he laughed and he said, sure. And so that was kind of the beginning entree for me into the hockey writing world. And, shortly thereafter, working there for a number of years while I was in high school, and then I went to university, they had a press credential to cover the Flyers. And so it was really just a fortunate turn of events for me. The writer that had the Flyers credential, his wife was having a baby and he could no longer use it. And they said, your only job is to go to every Flyers game and start, writing about the Flyers. And I was like, are they kidding? They're gonna have me do this. And that was kind of how it all started.
What kind of Flyers team were those? Who played in those teams?
So the first year that I spent around that team was 2007-08.
Okay.
That was Kimmo Timonen, his first year there, and that was the year that the Flyers went to the Eastern Conference Final against the Penguins, who then beat them and won the Stanley Cup. So that year, I had just met all of the other Flyers media to the point that you made. Started making connections, and then all of a sudden the opportunities that I had continue to grow and grow with some networking. And by 2-3 years later, I was working at the largest sports paper in the city and covering the team on a full-time basis as a 21-year-old. So really lucky in terms of the path that's followed from there. And I'm really fortunate for my start. And
also some deep runs in there as well. The Stanley Cup final to 10. So nice to get that in there early.
Yeah, that was my first season full-time, traveling with the team, going to every game.
Did you see the puck go in the game 6?
I did not, and I had a really good vantage point. I was sitting in the press box on the red line, and I had no idea what happened. All I knew was that I had a very tight deadline for the newspaper. I think I had 11 minutes, and I had 2 different stories that I was writing because it was either the Flyers are going to Game 7 or their season's over. And so there's not really a lot of overlap between those two different kinds of stories. So that's like the ultimate journalist nightmare.
Yeah. Well, it's always, I mean, we had a couple of those at the Global Series as well with overtimes there. So that's something as well. So you were in Philadelphia and now you're covering the NHL. So what was the path from there from locally covering the Flyers and then going into more like the league-wide coverage, and now with the Daily Faceoff, you're the main character for the Daily Faceoff. So how was that path?
So it's kind of an interesting story in that I'm guess I'm always looking for not a larger platform, but like if you want to be the best in or be part of the best in the hockey media landscape, it's kind of only natural to gravitate to Canada. Yeah. And so I was the Flyers beat writer for 6 years at the Philadelphia Daily News. And at some point, I saw a job posting at TSN, the big sports leader in Canada as a network, and that was in 2015, and they were hiring a senior hockey writer. And so I had reached out to an old friend in Bob McKenzie, someone that had kind of followed my work, and he was sort of one of the guiding voices and lights that helped get me to TSN, and then took me under his wing as an unbelievable mentor to just show me the ropes on both the hockey writing and TV side, and really learned how to be an insider from him, directly from the best. And nothing was ever off limits. Anything that I ever wanted to ask, learn how to do, he was always there to help me along. And I was at TSN for 6 years after that, bringing me to 2021. Pandemic hits, new world. The digital media space is constantly evolving, and that's when I linked up with Daily Faceoff to help build their different hockey platform that lives much more in a YouTube podcast space in addition to the writing.
You're mentioning the podcast. There's a lot of coverage you guys have. So recently you added Jeff Marek and the show for him as well. Could you just give a brief overview what's out there for my listeners?
A ton. Our goal at Daily Faceoff is to be the nonstop morning until night NHL hockey center of the universe on YouTube and digital media. And so any kind of hockey content that you're into, we start off every morning with our show called Morning Cup of Hockey. That's with Colby Cohen and Johnny Lazarus. And then we've got my show that's live, Daily Faceoff Live with Tyler Yaremchuk at 12 noon Eastern. So that's around 6 o'clock at night where you are. And then after that, Jeff Marek's show is on at 3, and there's other fantasy hockey shows. There's some gambling centered shows. There's different podcasts. I've got DFO Rundown that I'm part of with Jason Greger, and then I also do a one-on-one interview series called Frankly Speaking. There's a ton that's packed into that Daily Faceoff YouTube channel. And then as part of the Nation Network, we've got a whole bunch of different regional sites and networks that do a fantastic job covering their teams. If you're an Oilers fan, there's Oilers Nation or Flames Nation or Leafs Nation. There's so many different opportunities to kind of scratch that itch of the authentic hardcore hockey fan.
It's cool that you mentioned Oilers Nation because we have an Oilers Nation DE in Germany.
Yes. Yep.
And I was a guest a couple of weeks ago on their coverage. They have a YouTube channel there as well. There's a lot of, obviously with Leon Draisaitl playing there, a lot of interest from Germany, but not also in regards to him, but also historically for the Oilers. So it's great.
And
that
those
you
guys
have
from Oilers Nation DE, they come over to Edmonton every year. They make a trip.
Yes, they are. They did that a couple times, and they had some great experiences there. So it's always fun to see the fans also coming over from Germany, from Europe.
It's amazing to see how big and small the hockey world is at the same time, if that makes any sense.
Of course it does. It's globally, but it's still something where if you know someone else might know that. I mentioned to you Larry Brooks. I talked to him yesterday, and he mentioned I should say if I get connection to Uli Hiemer. He's a German player. He played for the New Jersey Devils back in the 80s. But Larry was there, and he said, "Well, just say hello to him. Just say hello to him. He was so nice. It was so much fun." So there's always a connection to someone on some level.
It's
So yeah,
amazing.
that's kind of cool. Yeah.
I say all the time, it's the world's smallest $6 billion industry. It really is, because there's always, to your point, someone that you know that knows someone else that can help connect dots. And that's part of the reason why I've been able to be successful. If it wasn't necessarily a help from Bob McKenzie, it was someone else, a team executive, or a lot of players that I formed relationships with early on in my career. Like, everyone has been helpful and welcoming at some point for someone that really has no business other than just being a hockey fan and player growing up to then make it as a hockey media person.
Yeah, and I mean, I could just say the same thing because I reached out to you. You were kind enough to come on the show as well, others as well. And for me, I mean, it's on a different level, obviously, as you guys do in North America. But still, if there wouldn't be people listening to or watching what we're doing, you wouldn't have the interest in there. So that's always fun to see that and have the connections with the fans there as well. You are doing a lot of stuff, and I mentioned one thing that is also something useful for my listeners is the line combinations you guys are putting out. Sometimes when I do play-by-play, I look at your page, I print out something, copy it out. Obviously, it might change, but that's also a very useful source for us. Is that also, do you know if that is from local insiders who are maybe at the morning skates who contributes to that? Or is that something where you guys rely on different sources?
So it's a bunch of different sources, and it changes every day.
Yeah.
So we have one employee at Daily Faceoff. His name is Brock Sagan, and I wanted to give him some credit. He's the guy behind the line combinations, and he's updating them a million times a day.
Yeah.
So anytime there's a change, if one of the local media people send out a tweet with that day's lines, or if the team posts them, or wherever they might come from. So he's seeing them in the morning at morning skate. He's checking them during warmups. He's checking for updates post game. So between lineup changes and also starting goalies is a big one. We have a starting goalies page that is one of our most highly trafficked, because everyone's not just interested in the gambling and fantasy part, but they want to know who's starting for their team that night, that we keep track of that. And then injury updates are huge. So he does all three of those things. And I don't know how he finds time to sleep, but 32 teams is a lot to keep track of, and he does a fantastic job. And it's another reason why, I mentioned our goal as a company is to inform and educate, and we want to get to everything that every hockey fan's interested in, no matter what it is.
Brock is the name, so thanks a lot, Brock. Okay, yeah.
Brock Sagan, yes.
Yeah. You mentioned how you were questioning how he could sleep. I'm always wondering, what are the busiest days for you as an insider? Is it more in regards to the trade deadline? Is it free agency? What are the days or maybe a period of time where you pretty much get just a couple hours sleep and then you get a call, a text message, whatever it is? What's the busiest time for you in regards to the league?
So there's two really busy periods. One is trade deadline and the other is free agency. Free agency is just a shorter period, but it really kind of encompasses a lot of the offseason, because there's trades. It's not just the signings, it's leading up to the draft and everything that's going on then. But I find that trade deadline for me is definitely the most stressful period, because you never really know where the next trade is going to come from or when it's going to surface. And so there's always that element of surprise that even for someone that's as plugged in as I am and talking to many people around the league, you just don't know. And you can't possibly, as one person, keep 100% tabs on every single team. So there's always something that you don't know, and there's always that element of just pure surprise. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because every year on Daily Faceoff, we start a 2-month countdown to the big day. And that happens to be today when you and I are speaking, January 7th. March 7th is this year's trade deadline. And so we have one trade deadline focused story that gets posted on our site every day leading up to it. And today, to kick things off, we have our trade targets board, where I have 25 players who are available that mining those names and finding out and trying to learn as much as I can. It's just an enormous undertaking of just calls that that need to be made. And so always trying to hunt down that information is the most challenging part, and then trying to find smart ways to share it while also not burning some of your sources.
You started the topic for me. I wanted to talk about that as well. There is a list of a lot of players there. Who would be one or two players when the season would have started and somebody would have told you, hey, those guys will be on your trade target board list? Who would be the one or two players you would be the most surprised of right now?
Well, the first one that stands out for me is Elias Pettersson. He's last on the list because I'm really not convinced that the Vancouver Canucks are going to trade him. But had you said at some point 9 months ago when he signed his extension that this would be a possibility that he would end up even being talked about, and it's for multiple reasons. Yes, there's been the drama that's been surrounding him and JT Miller, his teammate, who he apparently can't get along with, but also just purely his play on the ice. He hasn't played up to a level that's commensurate to his pay. And in the NHL salary cap world, that's such a big part of any team building exercise, is having players that properly live up to those expectations every year. And the fact that he's 26, there are, I'm sure, teams that are out there saying, wait, as a center, we could get our hands on this 40-goal, 100-point scorer that could be a real difference maker. There is interest for sure, but that's been clouded by his performance and also this friction that's existed in Vancouver's locker room.
That's also a play I was surprised. You talked about it, the production last year. Pretty much he signed the contract, and 1, 2, 3 weeks after that, he started to play worse and worse. It was bad in the playoffs. He didn't really perform in there. And I just thought, okay, maybe he had an injury and he will get or take care of it in the summer, and then he'll start fresh. But it's gotten worse, not from the playing standpoint, but as you mentioned, also from the inside standpoint. Just about that topic, how hard is it there sometimes to get information? Because what I can think of is the old days. I talked to Larry about that. In the old days, you talk to people in person. So if someone said something to you, you could maybe use it as a source, but there was not something that was written. Nowadays, if you get a text message, in theory, there's something written. There's something proof for it. Is it harder for you to sometimes get insights around those topics?
Well, I think by the nature of how much money is involved with these franchises and also these players, that everyone's increasingly not more difficult to deal with, but less revealing is what I would say. And so it's just the seriousness of it. We're not just talking about hockey anymore. We're talking about billion-dollar franchises and the stakes that are involved with pro sports. Now it's different than it was before. That said, to me, it all comes down to trust. Two things: trust and also mutual benefit. If I'm talking to 31 other GMs and this GM, it becomes an information trading game where, you have something else to bring to the table. If not, they don't really have much of a reason to talk to you. And so I've found that the best at it are people that can share and go back and forth. And with that, when you share information, there's also that inherent trust that comes with that too. So some of it is by text message, some of it is by phone. And then there's all sorts of other stakeholders that are around the game, whether it's league executives, whether it's agents, players. There's never really any shortage of people to talk to, but it comes down to those two things. You got to have the goods. And then the second thing is you got to have the trust. Yeah. And I think, by doing this year in and year out, being someone that shows up and is accountable to have those conversations in person as well, that, you're able to carve out a career for yourself and be able to do that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's built up throughout the years and with the work you've done so far.
And can be taken away very quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just make one error and the source is dried up and nobody wants to talk to you. Yeah. I can imagine that as well. So I think it's a dicey business to be careful around your sources and around the information you have.
Sure.
For sure. One thing that I'm curious about is you mentioned the Four Nations face-off break, and that could be something where things could happen. Um, first of all, I haven't checked it. Do you know if there's a freezing period around
There is
that? There's
not.
not. Okay, so that would be something. Um, just from your gut, is that something where you see teams trying to trade players earlier before that break, maybe to get them accustomed to their teams, maybe to get them early to some of those training sessions because there's not a lot of training going on. So it might be useful to, if you do a trade, maybe get a player there. Is that something that you might think might happen?
It's possible also because there's such a short runway after Four Nations face-off ends to then, to leading up to the March 7th deadline. So it will happen pretty quickly. I do think that there's some element potentially of that instead of having to trade for a player who then has to bring a suitcase and then, sprint to the next city. If you've got an 11-day break, to have that player be able to come in, get adjusted, either find a proper living situation, or if his family's coming with him, that's a whole totally different conversation. There's lots of elements to a trade that I think, general fans, who are just cheering, they don't think about or have to be consumed with because there's not a human element necessarily to what's happening. And so I do think that could be a factor. And also just from a being first to jump the market and to set prices and to be able to get players that you want as opposed to just, hey, we're interested in 7 different players at all these different price points and we're going to wait and see how this market develops, whether it's a buyer's market or seller's market. I think or I should say, in my belief, the teams that have been more successful in making trades have been very pointed and curated in their selections because they're going to go after someone that they know or believe has a high probability to fit with their team, as opposed to just making a random last-ditch move just to make a move, which I hate that phrase, but you see trades happen all the time where it feels like sometimes the GM is just doing it to say, hey, I'm doing something.
There have been some deals already. Do you see teams acting a little earlier than they usually do? I mean, the Avs changed their goaltenders. We have the Rangers situation with the memo coming out, stuff like that. There have been some trades. Do you think that teams might address issues earlier than they usually do?
Well, that's certainly been the trend this year, Lars. I would say there's already been 4 players that were on my trade targets board earlier this season that have already been traded. David Jiricek, Cam Fowler, Jacob Trouba, and Alexander Carrier. Those are 4 pretty sizable transactions that, look, it's very unusual to have a lot of that happen before the NHL's holiday roster freeze just prior to Christmas. So it's been more active. That said, nothing of the goaltending situation that you mentioned in Colorado. They swapped out both of their goalies. That's the first time that's ever happened before Christmas for any team. There was an under-the-radar trade of Oli Mata, who arrived in Utah. Like, there's been a lot of things that have happened this year that teams have been, I think, acting more so because they're so unhappy about their current situations that they've decided to step out and do something. Whereas usually in most seasons, for the most part, for better or for worse, a lot of teams are just what they are. I think teams have been antsy to try and make changes, and also perhaps because they see some openings here and some windows in a year in which I don't know that there's any one clear or 2 clear Stanley Cup favorites that has everyone scared.
Frank, I can see you could go on for hours. There's so much insight there. There's so much to talk about. It was a pleasure to have you on. Thanks a lot for your time. And I'll put in the links and the links to the podcast as well in the show notes. So everybody, my listeners always ask me who would be someone to follow, who would be some source to look at. And I've mentioned the Daily Faceoff. I've mentioned you in the past there as well. So I'm happy to do that again. And thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure, Lars. Great to be with you and enjoy the rest of the season, and looking forward to seeing you in my next stop in Europe.
That was Frank Seravalli, my third guest in episode number 500. Again, sorry for the sound quality in parts. That was on my part, and that was my fault. So I'm sorry for that. But I think that those were 3 good guests, great topics, great informations they shared there, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as always, if you guys have any remarks, questions, whatever you want to talk about around the NHL, around the podcast, please reach out to me through the various channels and platforms that are in the show notes there. And just for today, all I'm saying is thanks for listening, take care, and goodbye.
Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening. Bye, guys.